Good morning. Welcome. This is Angela Coulter, your Consciousness Transformation Ascension Guide and originator of Trinity Energy Progression, bringing you this week's Living the Shift. Linearity and non-linearity. It's funny that came up in conversation a couple of days ago, and it's sort of stuck out there because it's come up a lot, and we don't realize how much it is embedded in our consciousness to be linear, what we call linear. And when I say linear, I'm talking about very like there's a point A and a point B, and there's a direct connection. So what's interesting is that there are many things for us that we are very linear about. And that's it, and that's funny because then you have 10 different people. You can ask 10 different people, 10 different, the same question about, how do you get from A to B? And you'll get 10 different answers, which means there is not one set rule when it comes to linearity. So when we talk about going from point A to point B, right, we talk about things like time management, right? Linearity, we talk about time as a linear thing when it really is far beyond that. And actually, it's just what we created to measure, right? So linearity is really a measurement of connecting some dots. And when we look at that from a consciousness standpoint, we realize that good morning, Laurel. We realize that it is simply, when we look at that as, okay, well, it's a form of measurement, right? Linearity, time, space, that kind of stuff. It's all based on our perspective, and it's all something that we've created so that we could measure. And when we talk about measuring, that means we're talking about defining. We're talking about defining. We're talking about a box that the mind or the ego wants to create. So when we get down to it, linearity is connected to the ego, and there's nothing wrong with that. The key is that we have gotten so embedded in expectations around living in linearity that we get stuck in that, and sometimes we get in our own way with it. And let me talk about it. There's like a lot of different ways that this has come up in the past several weeks. So what do we call logical, right? When we talk about something that's logical, it's something that makes sense to the mind, right? Because of linear thinking and linear connections, connecting these dots. So we have exalted the expectation in the 3D world of linear / logical thinking as being the exalted thing, because that's what creates definition. And if that's the ego's purpose, which is to create definition, identity, separation, right? Then that has, been the purpose of the drive of the definition of the ego here, and of the definition of our entire existence here, pretty much, in the 3D perspective. Good morning, Gloria. So when we talk about So if you think about that, right? So we say, okay, so what if we created this entire existence to really immerse ourselves in the ego, in separation and definition, and, in creating and separation and identity, right? Which is pretty much what we've done. We've done it to a very beautiful extreme. And so the key is to see, though, that everything that we perceive within this frame of existence, because that too is a frame, a definition, is linear. It's something that we've considered, linear. So when we get out of linearity and definition, and we get out of that needing to keep things in a box, when we start transcending and we start living from a place of different level of consciousness, then we stop defining and limiting ourselves to be in linearity. But it's such a habit, because many of us have been here for many, many lifetimes. We have explored this to such a degree, and we're all part of the same consciousness anyway. So therefore, we've all done it. We're all here. We've all got an A+, because we have truly immersed ourselves in it. So, and my understanding is, in shifting, part of what is important is for us to get out of our own way in that linearity, right? Because we then stop ourselves by saying, well, to get from point A to point B, I have to do this, 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 and this, right? Those are expectations and definitions put out by the mind / ego. And so what's funny is we have put that in, we've put that as an exaltation in what we call leadership roles in this reality of, oh, well, he's so logical, he's so, analytical, he really gets the big picture because he just sees all the points together. And it's like, actually, that's non-linearity, but we'll get to that in a minute. But, you have, and it's become, discussion I was talking about the other night, it's become sort of a masculine attributed energy in a patriarchal society, right? And which, we're shifting. We're imploding right now, but we're shifting through. And so when we stop seeing things, and we can talk about that, because there's like a whole different way of looking at what we call masculine and feminine energy without looking at it with any judgment on what we created and what we then expanded into and what we really defined and honed and all that kind of stuff. We can talk about that another day. But so we have exalted, right? So if we have what we call like a patriarchal society, which we've had for a while, then, and we have exalted like separation-based energies, which is the ego and the mind, right? Then of course, then that becomes married. So then, people look to men as out of habit and what we've been taught as expectation. And I'm not saying this, like I said, no judgment, just for observation. People naturally look to men because they think men have the answers because they're so logical or so linear. How many times have you heard that? Oh, well, men are, okay, you see that in old, like 1800 texts, but you still hear it today. Or you don't even hear it. You see people doing this. I have seen a room full of very, very enlightened, conscious women who have like one or two men in the room, and they end up looking to the men for answers because the men just come in and they start talking in what they believe is logic and authority, and then automatically they just sort of like, and I've seen that multiple times, and it's interesting because we don't even realize we're doing it, right? It's become so entrenched. So in that, though, we have entrenched our belief that the logical is what we call logical, which is linear, is exalted to non-linear, or what we then equate to non-logical, and we say then that's not as good, that's not as, we say it's airy fairy or woo woo or nonsensical. Like, we put negative connotations to what we call nonlinear thinking, nonlinear consciousness, really, because it's. So what happens is, when we go beyond living in the linear, or focusing our energy in the linear, when we see the linearity for what it is, which is just the measurements and the dot to dot, we then see the whole picture, right? And so when we see the whole picture in one snapshot, we stop saying we need to connect all the dots, because the dots are already connected, because they already are integrated as a whole. It's just that we haven't been looking at them that way. When we look at the whole, then it doesn't matter whether I do this dot now or this dot now, like now, or this dot now, because it all comes together when you can see the whole picture. So that's a challenging thing for many to comprehend when they're very, very addicted to the linear thinking, which we all pretty much have been embodied, this part of our consciousness embodied here. So, like, when we say, oh, this doesn't make sense because this doesn't fit into this, or this doesn't fit into this timeline, then we limit ourselves, because now we're only looking at one line. Think of linearity. It's a line. The universe is not a line. The universe, the multiverse, is multidimensional. It's holographic. And time and space just only exist through the construct of what we've chosen. So, like one of the examples I talk about when we talk about specifically about time, right, is when I when you talk, we'll say when you watch Star Wars, and this is a great example. When you watch Star Wars, right? And when Yoda dies, they say, I don't remember how many years they say he is, right? They say he's whatever years old, 900 and blah, blah, blah. So my question is, on what sun? He doesn't live on Earth. We base our years on how many times Earth goes around the sun. So if you live on another side of the universe, then what is a year? And so then we think, oh, well, time is so definitive, and it's really not. I mean, even Einstein talked about that. And then there was the introduction of quantum physics, which then goes through into non-linearity to an extreme, and how everything is simultaneous. It's just where you want to focus your attention at any given moment. So when we start to really exist, and when we work in energy, when we work as divine consciousness, when we step out of separation and we exist as divine consciousness, we see everything. So here's an interesting, just a perspective I was explaining to somebody the other day. So in linearity, we say, okay, well, this happens at this point, and this, once it passes, it's in the past, and it isn't here anymore, right? True that. Except when we take away that partition of time, it all exists simultaneously. So we can shift into anything. So the example that I was talking to somebody, I was like, okay, I take notes when I do sessions, and I don't know how many people I've seen over 9.5 years. I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands. I don't even know at this point. I don't keep tabs. People come, they go, they come back, or whatever, and I have notebooks upon notebooks upon notebooks upon notebooks of notes that I've kept when I do sessions. But really, it's for me as a tool to see and step out of linearity when I'm in that session with that individual, right? And so when I look at that, I'm very present in that wholeness with the person. And when we get to being present in wholeness with someone, there is no time and space. So whether I am in presence with that individual today by our linear time, or 6 years from now, it's still the same moment, right? So what happens is, if you ask me the person's name, if you ask me some details of whatever, say probably 5 minutes after I'm done in a session with them, or 5 hours or whatever, I probably, more times than not, I wouldn't even remember. Sometimes you can give me a name, I wouldn't even remember either. Except when I come back to being in the same energy with that person again, whether it's 6 days, 6 months, 6 years later, the energy becomes, it never changed, the combination of the energy. So when I become in oneness in that energy again, I now have lost the time and space continuum. And then I remember almost everything that I had in discussion with that person, no matter how far in a different time, linear time period it was. So I remember these details, and people get so shocked. They're like, well, how do you remember all this stuff? It's been, years and da da da. And I'm just like, did you find, did you go back in my notes or whatever? And it's like, no, actually, it's just, I just have to allow myself to step out of space and time so that we're in this energy together. And then I remember these details like this. So when we exist that way, actually things become far more clear, because we're not trying to define and limit things into each moment and categorize them into each moment. So this sounds really sort of out there, right? But it actually, and well, it is out there because it's beyond the scope of what we're typically used to managing. But when we do, it actually becomes far easier. Because I don't worry about, I used to be somebody who was so anal. Yeah, I'll get to that in a second, Gloria. Great point. I used to be so anal about time and about keeping, notes and plans and all this kind of stuff. And then it's like, well, big picture, once I started, stepping out of that more and more, I realized, well, that's just a very small piece of the bigger picture, right? So then I stopped really being anal, because here's the thing. So when we then try to fit, because people are like, well, how do you still have to function in time? Like, you have appointments and stuff. I'm like, yeah, I do. I have a calendar, and the calendar reminds me when I have things. Sometimes it does, and I still forget. But oftentimes, most often, I'd say 95% of the time, say I have an appointment at like 2 p.m. and I am doing what I'm doing. I'm being present in the moment. I'm doing what I'm guided to do or be or whatever. And so I end up realizing that it's going to be 2 on the clock, 2:10 or so, before I'm actually ready and present at that place with whoever I have that appointment with. So 95% of the time, what happens is I get a text from the person that says, hey, I'm running late. It looks like I'm going to be there about 10 or quarter after. Is that all right? Things like that. It happens all the time. And I just always laugh, and it's like, of course, that's perfect. Always. And the same thing other ways around. So when we stop getting so, and then so here's the thing. Now there was no stress, because I was not trying to define myself. And I was like, yeah, it'll be fine. I know I'm gonna end up here at this point at actually 2:10 versus 2 o'clock. And I'm sure, because of the way the things are coming in presence, that it's just going to come together, and it always does. So funny. And the more we allow that to happen, the more it happens. It's really fun to see how synchronistic it really is, right? It's like, oh well, this really doesn't work for me, or I need another half hour or whatever. And then the other person says, oh, well, this came up. Do you mind if we do this like a half hour, an hour later? This always happens. Always, always, always. Like I said, like 95% of the time. So Gloria said, how about events and issues you've worked on and thought finished, but that sometimes later the issues or feelings are back? Right. So some people want to say, like, we talk about time being circular. We talk about it being spiral, energy of consciousness being a spiral. There is something that I talk about that came to me a while back called like a spiral of consciousness, right? So it's as we remember, we go through phases and pieces and parts, and it just sort of came to me. I should have printed that out. But, we go through pieces and parts in our consciousness that help us to expand what I call our remembrance in that wholeness. But when we take out the linearity on something, things seem to be more misshapen and more of a mishap, or more random. Nothing's random, but it's just simply that we're taking the dots out of like a linear thing, right? So we can take out any kind of shape whatsoever and just say it all happens in a non-linear fashion. We talk about circling back, but often we go through something and we say, so from a higher consciousness, this sort of gets into, it's a nonlinear thing too, but from a very different perspective. We have things outside of space and time that are like, say, soul agreements with other facets of ourselves that embody differently, and say, I want to learn this lesson in this way in separation. And the other one says, okay, I'm absolutely going to do that. And if you do this for me, like you do this for me, I'll do this for you. Okay, great. So then you go into this cycle of lessons, right? I call them, like, you can either have individual little lessons, you can have bigger themes. It's all the same kind of thing. But until we finish that theme, it's just going to come cycling back, right? So when we think we finished it, right, that's a linear thing, saying, okay, check that off the list. If there's any kind of crumb of leftover lesson that we wanted to learn from that whole thing, then it will come back and come in our face again, come in our consciousness again, to say, okay, well, so how do I do this differently this time, right? And so let's see, and this is how we deal with stuff in energy work. It's all nonlinear. It's not, there's an A to a B to a C to a D. I work with 20 different people, and they all might even have the same ailment or limitation or thing they want to get past. And yet we will have very different experiences working together on every single individual, because nothing is linear and defined in terms of why we're having certain, experiences or different lessons, right? So when we stop taking out the linearity and saying, well, I have to be like, oh, well, I'm done with this. I was done with that relationship. Well, I love when people say, well, I was done with those lessons with that relationship, and they jump right into another relationship. And in, a very short period of time, they're having the exact same experiences with this new person as they were having with the old one, only even more exacerbated, because the higher self says, well, yeah, this is part of that whole that's not linear, that whole that we are wanting to complete in lessons and experiences or whatever. And so, since you really were uncomfortable, weren't looking at it, or we're looking at it from this perspective, well, now I'm going to bring it to you, and I'm bringing it to myself in this perspective, so that I get the whole picture, right? And it's not, and the whole picture is the whole thing, right? And there's no linearity about the whole picture. It's multidimensional, it's holographic, and it goes into emotion and connection on different planes in different ways. I mean, sometimes you want to get nonlinear. And this is where, so people who have naturally lived outside a linear reality have been called schizophrenic and many other things, and put on medications and in insane asylums forever, right? Because the linear mind has been so prioritized. And so the funny thing is, and yet they get sort of ignored. And that's why many of us who went through big awakenings and stuff over the last several decades thought that, we're a little uncomfortable with the experiences, because it took us from linear to nonlinear very quickly. To see things multidimensionally is far different than seeing them in a flat, linear perspective, that it has to be this way, has to be. And when we do that, that's what we're doing. Every moment and every dot on that line has to be defined by one set of standards, right? That's what our expectations are. When we say, okay, well, I'm going to open my consciousness to see beyond that, to experience beyond that, and to understand beyond that, well, then things that you would never in the mind connect in a linearity come together in the whole picture, and that makes even more sense. And then you feel it and know it in a way that the mind never will. So people ask, well, how do you know this? And I'm like, because you just know it. And knowing far supersedes any of our senses. So it supersedes thinking, it supersedes seeing or hearing or touching or tasting or smelling. It is just, when I say people get to a knowing, and what happens is the mind then tries to backtrack. This is the challenge that many people have when getting into a higher consciousness existence and remembering how to exist in a higher consciousness, because the mind will constantly talk down nonlinearity by saying, well, how do you know this? You can't know this because we haven't had any structural thinking, any linearity that can define it. So it can't be real. It can't be legitimate. It can't be sane. And we go through all that. And so we have this very interesting thing going on with so many different levels within a very quickly shifting world that we've started and we've been here to be a part of, right? And so many more of us are remembering how to live and exist in nonlinearity, and to exist in a place of a more holistic perspective, multidimensionality, holographically, whatever you want to call it. But that takes out then what we call logical thinking. It takes out and it deprioritizes all of that, because we realize how limited linearity really is. Yes, in getting from a point A to point B in a straight 3D manner, that can happen. But how many times have you thought you were going to get from point A to point B? You defined what that was supposed to look like, an expectation, and then you went from point A to point D to point F to point Y to point B. And you were like, oh, well, that wasn't in the plan. Well, actually it was. It's just that you weren't looking at things in a nonlinear fashion. You were just looking at them in very straight linear thinking. So this is the practice for us to get into as we get into higher consciousness. As we remember how to exist in higher consciousness while we are embodied here, because we are existing in higher consciousness. It's just how much we allow that connection from the higher self to the lower self. And many times we understand, we know that's that knowing that's completely nonlinear. And again, if you really want to explore this, you can go into quantum physics. There's so much stuff about this in quantum physics and stuff like that. Even Einstein, well, which and is part of all the whole quantum physics stuff. But anyway, so if you do that, and you say, okay, when you start to say, okay, well, I trust my knowing over my linear thinking, then it usually gets us where we're going, and in a much more complete way, so that we then don't, like Gloria asked about circling back around, then we don't do that because we just take care of this all at once without an A to B to C to D to E. It's just done. And it might look like in a logical fashion we're doing it from A to Y to B to X to R, right? And that's okay too, because that's still sort of linear. But, and then there's other stuff that's not even on those like letter planes that would be thrown in that are a part of it. So there are things that so then when we start to allow that, then we start seeing some pretty cool stuff, really cool stuff. Like then you start seeing stuff in other dimensions that live by a completely different set of rules, or that we created with a completely different set of rules or whatever, and how it overlays the dimensions that are here, and that we have so many different dimensions just here on Earth that overlay each other and are interrelated. Things that don't make sense in the 3D start to make sense when you know it from a more holistic perspective. So, and a more holographic perspective. So there's so much more to explore. And, you might ask, where do you start? So, like, the thing is, when you know something, the mind wants to know, how do you know it, right? And so what happens when I teach people on helping them to remember how to helping them to remember how to exist in this way, right? In a much more whole, divine consciousness kind of perspective. The biggest challenge that they have is the simplicity of wholeness and non-linearity. Because when you know something, you know it in its wholeness, not in every single aspect of what it is, and not needing to define and dissect every little piece and part there is. So then what happens is the mind tries to interject and be like, oh, well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And I don't understand. And I need more information. And I can't trust this because I don't know all the dots, right? When we get beyond that, we just realize that, well, the mind's never going to get all the dots, because the mind is using things, definition based on what it sees and what it experiences here. And here is a very small piece of the holographic universe. Multiverse. So, and it's not to discount the mind, because the mind does a great job at defining what it sees here, right? But then it's to employ the mind or the ego to say, okay, so you got this down. Now let's remember the rest of all of this, and we allow it to come together like this holographic, amazing puzzle that it is. And when we do that without trying to define and limit the pieces and the way the pieces fit together, if you think of a jigsaw puzzle, if we stop saying, oh, well, this piece has to fit together with this because it's got this edge and whatever else, and just say, well, what if there were no edges and it just all was together? What would that look like? I wouldn't have to put the puzzle together at all because it's already there. So it's shifting to a completely different way of perceiving the multiverse. And not only that, but changing our way of, I want to say prioritizing, but actually allowing ourselves to trust in what we know over what we see or define or create through logic. Because again and again, I always goes, well, this doesn't make logical sense, or this isn't logical, or whatever. And it's like, well, but you're only looking at things in one straight line. And almost nothing in our multiverse is a straight line. That's just what we've created to measure again. So in this week for your home play, I mean, this is a lot of stuff. There's a lot to really allow yourself to comprehend. So sit in the energy of this and look into quantum physics if you haven't already. There's some pretty cool stuff out there. that talks about the basics of this. And if your mind wants to define it in a scientific way, which is funny because quantum physics or this knowing is very non-scientific, but we've expanded that to allow the consciousness and what we call science to start to mesh anyway, right? But then we have to just let go and trust and know, because the more we allow ourselves to be what we are in wholeness, then it is to go far beyond how we've defined. So this week in your home play is to go and just look at where you're still trying to manage your existence in linearity, to see where you're saying, oh, that's not logical, or I need more, information, or I need this more defined to be able to do this. Or is your or listening and then paying attention to what is guidance telling you that might not make sense, but that you can trust when you take it out of linearity. And to know that actually non-linearity is more of a holistic, holographic approach than linearity or logic. And it's funny because many people will huff at that because we have so exalted that here in this part of our existence. And now's the time to say, oh, it's great for this piece, this tiny little piece, but there's so much more to the picture than that. And so when we accept that, then we can go far beyond where we've been. And it makes us shift, helps us to shift, support us shifting so much faster. So thank you for joining. A little bit of a nugget to sit on this week. So I'll see you next week. This is Angela Coulter signing off with this week's Living the Shift. Have a good one.